Hello and welcome back to another EDH Deck Tech video. Today we're going to be going over a couple budget deck lists that I created. Last week I opened up 2 of the Phyrexia All Will Be One complete bundles, and from those boxes I picked out 10 different legendary creatures with the intention of creating one brand new EDH deck. Now, of those 10 creatures, a few were a little uninspiring to pick from. They felt more like they were designed for standard or as legendary matters fillers. A few of them were very powerful, Atraxa for example, but where I intend on playing this, specifically building the deck out of a budget, can't really do that. Some of them also require extensive deck design, decks to be built around them thematically, and since I wanted to play with the pool of cards that I opened up, as many of them as possible, since they require their own deck, I couldn't quite place them. So that got us down to just 2 options to pick from. On our screen here, I'm going to go over some deck lists that I created. Obviously, if you're watching the video, you know that I chose Venser. We will have a very budget-friendly, approximately $45-ish deck list as a starting place. Then I created a slightly enhanced version of that deck, something that's approximately $80. And then I also have a finalized deck, not a 100% optimal deck, but a very good deck if your budget is not a concern. And we'll be going over each card, well, most of the cards in these decks, explaining the strategy, the attempt, and the goal. So let's switch over to the computer and take a look. We are on Moxfield for deck lists today. I used to use Tapped Out as a website. Their website, unfortunately, is loaded with forced advertisements that even an ad blocker doesn't always catch. So we're using Moxfield. Let's pop over to a few of my decks here. Kevik is one of the 2 I want to eventually build around, and this is the rough draft of a very generic ETB value deck. I will go through, I'm not going through these decks, these are just the generic cards. Vor is another of the commanders I really do want to eventually build. I like what this commander does. It feels like it wants to combine shadow creatures, like unblockable creatures, and a swarming infect type. And I think that's interesting. I don't think there's anything that really does what he does, but I will most likely revisit him. It's just Kethik and Ivor require too much outside cards to build. With the pool of cards I have to work with, couldn't really get there with these 2. Now, the last 2 I picked was Migloz and Venser, and of those 2, I was actually able to build a completely functional 100-card EDH deck for both of them. My girlfriend and I, we enjoyed playing. This is her deck that we made for her, and she played this, and I played the Venser version using cards only pulled from last week's box, and we played a couple games. I got crushed repeatedly because Migloz is very cost efficient for what he does. This is not, again, a deck tech for Migloz. This is literally the cards that I pulled last week, and we were able to squeeze into a 100-card deck. Essentially how those games went, she was able to consistently get Migloz out very quick and early, and then find ways using the proliferate in the deck to make him into a very quick and aggressive Voltron commander. Again, Migloz feels more like he's designed for standard at the time. I'm not sure if there's a really good place for him other than maybe someone who just really likes the Phyrexian Beast as a commander. This is the Venser deck that I pulled. Every card in this deck was from those boxes last week. And ignore the prices down here because I pulled some very good cards. This is not a deck tech. This is just the pulls. You can consider this a draft deck, if you will. Because this deck was made from approximately 24 packs of cards and the Gucci packs as well. But this is what I played against my girlfriend's Migloz deck. And while it had some very good potential here, obviously it's full of some very unexciting cards. So this one, it was a good starting point, and it gave me the inspiration to choose to go with Venser instead of focusing on Miglaws. Miglaws was the other commander I was considering because I also did pull a foil Miglaws. But we chose Venser, which is why you're here in this deck tech. So we will now go over Venser, the card itself. He is a 2-mana 1/3 Phyrexian zombie wizard. He has lifelink and toxic 1. And whenever I proliferate, he has a triggered ability. He will either create a legendary 3/3 golem, which is named, it is called the Hollow Sentinel. And the artwork on the token looks like Karn, which is cute. The second option is that you can give an artifact creature, either an artifact creature you control, lifelink and flying. So when you look at this, there are a few ways you can take him. Obviously, zombie, tribal, wizard, tribal, whatever you want. The options that most people go for are infect or planeswalkers, because your commander does stuff with proliferating, and creating a flying artifact chump blocker is very good for planeswalker defense. There are combos where you can make infinite proliferate triggers using Venser, so you can use him in a graveyard kind of strategy if you want that as a win condition. But I chose infect. There are, of course, other options as well. A very fun flashback to 2010-ish. I used to have a Rule 0 EDH deck built around Tuk Tuk, the Explorer, where the commander was not Tuk Tuk, but the commander was the golem that Tuk Tuk made, the actual legendary creature. Now, that's a fun Rule 0 thing, but where I play online, I can't go into every single game with a bunch of randoms asking to Rule 0 my commander. That is something that you might have an interest in doing. If you have a consistent play group, try to see if they will allow you to Rule 0 the legendary Hollow Sentinel as your commander, because there are some golem effects that you can do. There's a lot of golems in the black and blue color pie. There are some ++ artifact triggers. Like, there's a lot of ways you can have fun with that, but that is not what we're doing today. If you are unfamiliar with how Infect or Toxic specifically works, Toxic is the new version of Infect. A player with 10 Infect points, like counters on them as a player, instantly loses the game. It's a state-based effect. Toxic is a new version. It used to be Infect itself was the damage. So a creature with 5 power that had infected 5 infect damage. Now it says Toxic 1, Toxic stacks. So if you give Venser something that says equipped creature gets Toxic 2, then he would then have a total of Toxic 3. So even though he's a 1 power creature, he would do 3 points of poison damage. And the lifelink there is, again, I think that's just mainly for the standard environment. So let's start with the actual budget deck text. This is essentially about $45. Again, if we're using Moxfield, Moxfield's a little strange when it comes to pricing cards. For example, they think every single card, no matter what, costs 35 cents minimum. So basic lands, for example, every card here, you will never see a card go below 35 cents while we're going through this. So this price down here, ignore that price. The better option here is, if you look, you can go to a TCG player link, and it cuts it down to about $45 at the time of this recording. Now, we will start with what makes this deck different from this pile of draft cards. And that's basically the fact that the actual Brood deck has a goal. And that goal is Infect. And we're not just using draft fodder to do the Infect. So we gave ourselves a goal. And to do that goal, we could attack with Venser or infect creatures to try to get infect damage off. Venser is good at casting very early and maybe getting one opponent infected. But in EDH, we're playing multiplayer, and this doesn't quite work the way it does in a 60-card constructed format. You can technically swarm the board with a bunch of infect creatures, try to mush and get in there, but a board wipe will set you back into the Stone Ages, and that strategy doesn't really work in today's era of EDH. Instead, we have some new cards that they have printed that have actually enabled Infect to work much better. In our colors, we have 5 of them. That's Infectious Inquiry is the first one, which essentially is, we're looking at spells that give each player or each opponent an infect counter. Again, we have 5 in our colors. There's one creature, it gives an infect counter too. This was the original version that did that. But we have Infectious Inquiry, which is a nice little draw spell, but each opponent gets 2. And if you notice, these cards, no matter which price point this deck goes to, this super cheap one, the mid one, or the high-end one, by focusing on the strategy, each one of these cards is dirt cheap. Like the rat is kind of expensive, $1, but most of these, you're looking at like 50 cents about each, except for one. There is only one actually expensive card in this deck, expensive being a $4 card. This came only in the Precon, the XL Precon, which is why it's currently expensive. But the other ones are commons and uncommons from the one will be all set. Then we have Prologue to where's it at here? Prologue to Phyresis. Each opponent gets a poison counter. The important part about this one is this card is 2 mana. Most of them cost 3-ish, thereabouts, but the Prologue itself is only 2, and of course it replaces itself. Very good cantrip. The instant speed ones are also very good because you can hold them up until the end of turn and do surprise, infect, or proliferation. Instant speed proliferation is always the best. We have Araska's Fall, which is again instant speed, and it's just a really good edict effect. Remember when Fleshbag Marauder was just the most common staple, and now we have instant speed versions that just hit each button. And of course the rat. So we have 5 of these spells. Now that's our goal, is to cast one of those 5 at some point, hopefully earlier in the game. To get to them, being on a budget, we can't plug expensive tutors, but we do have a few. We have Invasion. This is an Invasion of Avaricos. It's a battle. Invasion of I can't pronounce that. This is a battle. In short, what it does is it comes into play for 5 mana. You give it to an opponent. It has 7 defense counters on it. But when it comes into play, you will tutor for a spell from your deck and put it to your hand. Unlikely, very unlikely that we will be able to ever flip this. Because to flip it, we have to attack it for 7 points of damage. When flipped, it does turn into something else this deck might want to do. This is a spell slinger deck. So being able to copy our instances and sorceries means that we can proliferate faster and more without card disadvantage. But being able to flip it in this deck, unlikely, and it has 7 defense. In short, treat this as a 5 mana tutor that might do something later if maybe your golem likes to attack. We have one other tutor in the deck, which is very budget. Ring Sight is brand new. This basically is the perfect turn 3 follow-up to your Venser, because you can tutor for any card in your deck as long as Venser's in play. As long as it's a colored card. It has to be a colorful card. You can't hit artifacts or lands or things like that. Now, there are a total of, in this deck list, 24 cards that proliferate. And that's all over the place. There's just Proliferate, draw a card. Proliferate when it dies as a very good defense creature. Just Proliferate when it attacks. And a lot of these can repeatedly proliferate. And 24 of them, you only technically need 9 if we get going the way we want. If we hit a spell that hits all of our opponents with 1 infect, and then 9 proliferate effects, then that's good. So that's a very big abundance of these. There are, of course, some very scary ones. Flux Channeler is luckily one of the best cards for this deck, and one of the cheapest cards in this deck too. Essentially, this means that every non-creature we cast, every cantrip, every counterspell, every draw, every board wipe, it will add an extra proliferate for us. Going on down, we do have a lot of creature answers. What people don't tend to like is Infect, and it does have a bad rap. But as someone who has played Infect before this new block, way back when there was a very limited amount of Infect and you were basically stuck with Skithiryx, or just Tainted Strike on a big commander, or the Overwhelming Stampede, whatever that one is, Triumph of the Hordes. Those used to be the main ways of winning with Infect. Maybe a Blightsteel Colossus. Those strategies, if you put Infect creatures in your deck, most EDH tables used to just wreck you. Nowadays, the power creep has changed, but so has the actual ability to deal with something like Infect. So while Infect still has a bad notion about it, this is considered a low powered deck. This is not mid. And even when I start adding more powerful cards, even though our strategy is infect, this is still a low power deck. The best version of this, not the optimized Venser version, it actually just fits in mid. It's not even high powered. So keep that in mind. You will get unwanted hate just by playing infect. But to survive in that game, we have to have a lot of creature answers, because we will get run over very quickly. A lot of infect creatures, our commander, for example, is a 1/3. A lot of these creatures are just tiny, itty-bitty things that don't do anything. So we have board wipes. It's kind of a newish board wipe. It's a budget board wipe, being that it's $1, and it has the potential to give you something later. A lot of budget board wipes in black splash callers are about 6 mana. This one is 6 mana. It could leave us with our commander if the board depends on what other legendaries are available. But later on, it could also turn into a creature. Marchesa doesn't really do anything for the deck other than just be there. It's an option. It's a 6 mana board wipe that comes with a possible upside. But as I said, we have a lot of creature bounce, ways of just killing creatures. Deadly Tempest is one of the better board wipes that you can play in budget. For literally 50 cents, you can get a board wipe that it can actually just kill someone playing tokens. Decree of Pain's a staple in budget. Necromantic Selection's a great board wipe that can actually bring back something if you need defense or an enter the battlefield trigger. We have a washout down here because we're playing just nice ETB value. There's Evacuation to tie it off. So these are the kind of cards that you would expect to see in a delicate deck trying to do something, maybe a little glass canny. A little bit of, not exactly a combo, but something that's fragile and needs creatures to die. Luckily, a lot of the proliferate cards tend to have creature removal or negative counters associated with them. Grim Reflection is one of the older ones, but like just something like Drowning Ichor is an amazing card. It's a 2 mana. Everyone might have another proliferate counter on their poison, but also -4/-4 is a creature. And even the repeatable ones like Contagion Clasp come in with a negative counter, which is fantastic. And this deck gets to play 2 counter spells. We have the original one from the original Mirrodin block called Fuel for the Cause. It's just a big, expensive 4 mana counter spell, but it proliferates. There's a new one that counters a spell if it is countered. If the value of the spell is 3 or less, you get to proliferate as well. And to finish this deck off, we're ignoring these lands. These are super budget lands, like the cheapest lands that you can get to get a 2-color deck functional. But we do have some slightly big draw spells. Just one of my absolute favorite spells in any Black Splash deck is Moonlight Bargain. It gets around things that hate on draw, like a Notion Thief, because you don't draw the cards. And at 5 mana for 5 is a pretty good value, especially at instant speed. You do this at the end of turn, usually in a Reanimator deck, so you can pitch big, scary things. But then we also have some X spells, like a Damnable Pact. Things like that, just to try to draw really big later in the game, hopefully after we play mana. There are some mana effects here that you can add counters to, and as you proliferate, they will add more and more counters, making them very big, scary mana rocks. Pentad Prism has a few ways of going almost infinite, because you can keep proliferating the charge counter with the mana that you use, essentially discounting your spells by 1 for every proliferate. And of course, Pyramid of the Pantheons. This is a cute card. Realistically, you should probably play a better mana rock. This is here because it's fun to play with what could be a 1 mana Gilded Lotus with some cost investment. Throne of Geth it's a scary card. That is the half of the combo that works with Venser. We will get to that combo when we get to the deck that runs the combo. And of course, there's always the dream of getting the Replicating Ring to go off. The rest of this is just, again, very generic, adding Toxic, a little bit of value. There's a reason some of these cards are here. This is not an actually 35-cent card, for example. This is like a nickel. No one's going to ever charge you very much for a card like this. And then the budget lands. Access Tunnel is here because it can, of course, give Venser unblockable if you need to get that 1 extra little Toxic off in the beginning of the game. We have a Karn's Bastion, which is a single land that can proliferate. This is probably one of the better lands you want to get. And again, luckily, very cheap land. But let's move on to a slightly upgraded version of this deck. So I have, after opening last week's 2 bundles, like the boxes, the 24 packs, I have the majority of these cards already. And I believe it would cost me less than $20 to create this deck by using last week's cards and about $20 worth of purchasing. So I'm going to actually do that. I'm going to purchase the $20 worth of cards and a few of the cards in this deck list. This is a Venser deck list, the same deck list before with strict upgrades, slight adjustments, essentially approximately about an $80 value of a total deck. So let's go on through down. Again, ignore down here at the bottom. The deck purchase on TCG Player, for example, is about $75 at the time of this recording. The major changes here are we added some of the better proliferate cards. There are a few expensive proliferate cards. For example, Vrask. Let me change this to one that you can read. Here. Now, luckily, I opened up one of these last week, so I get to play a Gucci version of this card. But that's what kind of upgrading the deck does. We get slightly better versions of cards from the cheaper deck list. So this is a repeatable proliferate and draw and creature removal effect that can come out about turn 5-ish, depending if you want her loyalty to be lower. We don't go for that ultimate. I mean, something like that is a dream. This deck should hopefully have already infected everyone enough by the time she can actually ultimate. But of course, a Planeswalker in a deck that wants to proliferate, she can creep up there pretty quickly. As you saw, we did lose one of the invasions. Again, that was one of the worst board wipes. It was replaced with slightly better cards. But let's go through the slightly better proliferate cards first. Next, we have Staff of Completion. This is, again, another new card. Slightly more expensive, but it has a lot of options. It can draw us cards, it can repeatedly proliferate, and we can pay mana to untap it. But again, at $7, as you're seeing on here, that's an expensive investment. But that is the kind of card that you want to upgrade your deck with. We also have, I'm going to fail this pronunciation horribly, Tekuthal. Tekuthal. Whatever. Essentially, in this deck, while you can proliferate twice, this is it's better to treat this as removal bait. A scary effect. You're likely not going to have counters on your permanents to make it indestructible. So what you most likely would want to do while playing this, use 4 mana. Don't cast it when you have 4 mana. Cast it when you have a follow-up plan to proliferate, specifically, hopefully, an instant speed proliferate. Because when people see this, they will scurry to try to kill it, because mythic, scary, double effect, new dominant cycle, it's a very good card, and if it sticks around, it's very good for you, but it is also definitely removal bait. There's another expensive card in here, the one that also came in the Commander Precon. Again, it's only been printed, I believe, just that one time. It is a good mana rock that comes into play and automatically proliferates. Very fun if you can make copies of it, since it's not a legendary artifact, but due to the financial cost value, it could not fit in that previous deck, and it definitely should be in this deck. Let's go on down to some of the other upgrades. So we do have better tutors in this. One of them is Dark Petition. There's a brand new card that came out that we'll talk about shortly called the Beseech the Mirror. But what this does is, we are a Spellslinger deck, is incredibly likely by the time we have 5 mana, we will be able to have that spell mastery. So this can tutor for and then give us the mana to cast one of those enabling tutors, like the Infectious Inquiry, the Phyresis Outbreak. Like, both of those cards are fantastic follow-ups to exactly this. Another good follow-up to this is the Muddle the Mixture, which is another fantastic card. Not exactly budget-friendly, but is not up there like a Demonic Tutor. This is a fantastic card because you can use it early game as Disruption, or if the 3 mana, you can tutor for a 2 mana spell. Again, we have 1 2 mana spell that is our special enabling spells if we're having a hard time getting infect damage in. So we can tutor for this, or we can use this to tutor for one of our draw spells. There's a lot of 2 mana spells in the deck. This is an X black spell, but it is 2 converted mana cost. Something like this is a very good utility card if you're on a budget, since it does multiple things. And of course, if you're looking for just a pure spell tutor, we have Solve the Equation, a 3 mana tutor for any spell, and put it into our deck, instant or sorcery that is, which is the kind of spells we want. I forgot to mention this while we were looking at the previous deck list. Magus of the Will, this is a spell slinger deck. This and the budget one before. This was in the cheap one. The best card that you can have in this style of deck is Yawgmoth's Will. The problem is, of course, the fact that Yawgmoth's Will costs $100 to $200 depending on what day of the week it is. Magus of the Will is Yawgmoth's Will. The problem is it requires a turn. Everyone will see this. You have to have a turn cycle or give it a haste, or you're spending more mana. But for the exact same cost, if it survives a turn, you can activate it, sack it, and rebuy your entire graveyard. You can play lands and artifacts, whatever you want. Specifically in our deck, we're wanting to fill up our graveyard with cantripsy, like proliferate cards, and the Magus there can buy them back. If you have an infinite budget, that's obviously a Yawgmoth's Will, and that's obviously something that you'll see in the next deck list after this. One of the fun things you can do with Venser, since he creates a golem token for us to sacrifice repeatedly, is if you have ways of proliferating, you can keep casting Venser, or proliferating and casting to create that golem. And then you can sack the golem for slight value. There's a lot of these you can play. In the previous deck, the cheaper one, we have a Village Rites, which does not exactly the same thing, but there's a bunch of these you can play. The problem is, if you load them all up, then you're missing spots for your proliferate card. And if you keep running into these cards without the proliferate card, then you won't have the golem to sacrifice. So Deadly Dispute is it costs more because it makes the treasure token, which is coveted at this time. But we get to play with that one as well. The last card that was really added to this deck to make it different was the Primal Amulet. Just like this Invasion, when you flip it, casting and copying spells can be very good. And we are a spell flinger deck. So it discounts our spells, which is nice. But more importantly, after we cast 4 spells, it will turn into a land that we can then use to copy our spells. And again, that's just good repeated value. So, I don't believe I changed anything else on the land. I believe the lands are all exactly the same. But this deck is essentially the previous deck, with about $35 to $40 added, specifically the Vraska, the Staff, the Glistening Sphere, things like that. But let's go on to one final version of this deck. This is the more expensive version of the deck where, again, this is not 100% optimized. This is if you had the cards maybe from a previous EDH deck, you can squeeze them in. But a lot of cards in this deck change. We still have a lot of the same. We're still going with the exact same plan of casting a spell to give everyone Infect and then proliferate enough times. The biggest changes here you'll see are just the quality of the cards. So we actually have a Skithrix this time. We're playing the Crusader, so we have some more Infect. Spellseeker is one of the better tutors. Again, this can get any 2-drop spell out of our deck. Gives us a good defensive blocker. We still have the Dominus, but we also have Toxrill. Let me change this to one that is easier to read. There we go, Toxrill. This is kind of in the board wipe slot. It's a very expensive creature, and just like Tekuthal, this is kind of a bait spell. The spell that you want to play to make your opponents concerned or deal with that instead of something else that might be going on. But this can essentially overcycle turns board wipe for you. And if you're proliferating, specifically at instant speed, then you can kind of control how big some creatures can get. Finally, we also do have Yawgmoth. This is a potential repeated proliferate effect. Now that we're playing with less of a budget, we have some better options like Reshape. We have a Golem to sacrifice, so we can go get some of our better artifacts over here. Our mana rocks have been slightly upgraded with these 3 swords. I like Sword of Hearthenholm, Sword of the Animist, and Bitterthorn. I love these 3 cards in non-green decks because they ramp you their essential card advantage. Mana rocks blow up easy, basic lands don't, and we have a 2-mana commander that can get in pretty quick and easy. The last equipment here is Truth and Justice. Again, a fairly expensive equipment. It has a proliferate effect, and giving Venser Pro Blue White is actually very good. Going on, we spoke about the tutors already. Beseech the Mirror, we have a thing to sacrifice to it for its bargain cost. So for 4 mana, we can go grab something and cast it right away. Unfortunately, this is extremely expensive at the time of this recording because I believe it is in standard. People are using this to go get shielded, I think, and just putting her straight into play. Which, I mean, that's a very powerful effect. If you happen to have one of these, definitely run it. We have better board wipes again. Black Sun Zenith, maybe we want to control what does and doesn't die. We can proliferate specific counters after we cast a spell like this. We have better board wipes as in Damnation. I believe there's a Toxic Deluge down here as well. Seagate Restoration is a strict upgrade for drawing better cards. Going on, of course, there's, as I mentioned, Yawgmoth's Wills. Most likely the best card in this style of deck. We want to draw a bunch of cards that are cantrippy. We want to fill the graveyard with spells, and if we can just happen to cast all of those spells from the graveyard, we're likely to just win the game off this one spell. But going on down again, there's better tutor options right here. Stroke of Genius is another instant speed draw spell. This is just a personal favorite. I know there's a bunch of newer, better versions of cards like this nowadays. And of course, there's a Word of Invention, which we will talk about shortly. A Word of Invention is a tutor for an artifact that is instant speed. It puts it straight into play. We're going to talk about that combo here in shortly. And Vampiric Tutor to go with the Demonic Tutor. The lands did get a severe upgrade. There is an Urborg and a Coffers here, since we have a number of X spells in the deck. And to help enable the Coffers and Urborg, we have an Expedition Map. This is a cheap little mana rock that you can, or artifact that you can use to get any non-basic land out of your deck. If you already have the Coffers or Urborg, then you can get something like a Myriad Landscape or an Unblockable Land or Karn's Bastion. But then we have other things like the Phyrexian Tower. This is helpful since we have a Golem we don't mind sacrificing for some extra mana. Ink Moth Nexus, an infect flying block or attacker if we need it. And better color fixing lands. We have Watergrave, Delta, things like that to help fix our colors better. Let's go ahead. This is another expensive card that is fantastic in this deck. This is essentially a second Flux Channeler, except it counts creatures as well. But unfortunately, it is a $15 to $16 card. And imagine just having this and a Flux Channeler out and casting 2 or 3 spells, then all of a sudden everyone dies. So there's a reason that card's expensive. I believe it's only been printed just one time. But let's talk about the Throne of the Geth, Venser, and the Dross Scorpion. So, going over this combo, Venser has a triggered effect when you proliferate. You can create an artifact token. Dross Scorpion here says whenever it or another artifact creature is put into a graveyard, you untap an artifact. Now, a token does go to the graveyard before it ceases to exist. It will trigger the Dross Scorpion. And the Throne of Geth says tap, sack an artifact, proliferate. So, if you have these 3 cards in play, and you have a Golem, somehow you proliferated once already, or maybe you just sacrifice some trash to the throne to get your proliferate trigger. But don't do that because then the throne will be tapped. So you have to have something already to make sure you already have your Golem in play. You will sack the Golem to the Throne of Geth. You will get a trigger from Venser to then create another Golem. The Dross Scorpion will see the Golem that you sacrificed die, and it will untap or allow you to untap the Throne of Geth. This creates a loop where you can create infinite proliferate triggers. And there's a few other infinite proliferate triggers you can do. This is the cheapest and most cost-efficient one, I believe. And it doesn't require haste. There's no tapping of a creature. You just have to have these 2 parts. They are very cheap, cost-efficient, mana-wise. Draw Scorpion, 50 cents, 4 mana. Throne of Geth, $1, 2 mana. Your commander, 2 mana. We are also in the colors that can very quickly assemble a combo like this. Word of Invention, for example, is an instant speed. You can, at the end of an opponent's turn, tutor for a missing spot or missing piece and put it straight into play. You have all of the reshape effects. You have things like that you can literally assemble this combo very quick. Because of that, this deck right here, just because of there's a quick combo, this is no longer applicable for a low-powered Q. Infect is still not very strong, but when you start having the potential to just win out of nowhere with a combo, or you have the cost of a Yawgmoth's Will to rebuy your entire spent cache of spells, that then pushes the deck from low to mid. But that is the main bits of how this deck would function, or best function. Again, there are obvious upgrade potential here still. I have a high tendency to play a bunch of basic lands. I like, personally, the swords and equipment that get basic lands into play. You can completely rework that entire section to have mana rocks if you're more accustomed to signets and talismans and stuff like that. If you want this to be more combo-centered, you can, of course, get the other proliferate combos in here. If you want and have the value, you can, of course, plug way more planeswalkers in here. You can proliferate a lot in this deck. So if you have other planeswalkers that just help you win the game, getting to them to have a higher ultimate level faster can definitely do it. But this is what I would consider to be a fun deck for mid. So I am going to actually go back to this one. I usually stick in the low queue where I play, and this is more likely what I will be playing on my channel. So I again from the cards I opened up last week, I have all of the cards in here minus about 10 to 15. Specifically Phyresis Outbreak. It's just a card that's hard to find because it only came in a precon. But this is still kind of too low for the low queue that I play. I'll get run over the minute people see me cast an infect spell. So I need to get a kind of a merger between these two budgets, the cheaper and the mid budget. And hopefully soon on my channel, if I get some good gameplay that doesn't have corrupt audio or anything like that, we will see some gameplay footage of this deck, or a version of this deck. Again, in the cards I opened up last week, I opened up some very nice cards. I got the Oil Slick Veraska, I got an Oil Slick Jace. Some other cards will show up in the deck that I play that's not going to be listed here. It's simply because I already have those cards. This is a theoretical deck list I created with the intent of keeping a budget in mind. And if budget is not that much of a concern of yours, then check this one out. I will go to the TCG Player. This is about $620-ish. Mainly that's Yawgmoth's Will and the lands. I believe Yawgmoth's Will is the most expensive card. Then we have a bunch of $20 lands, like Pluto Delta, things like that. But we will be playing something like this. Now, the neat thing is I really liked the lands that I got in those Fat Pack boxes, the gift bundles, those foil ones. And if you were familiar with my channel, you know I have this Grixis deck that's full of all these textless cards. I'm only playing a 3-color deck in Grixis, and I have all the white and green cards. I don't play green-white very often. One of the other things that is very good with this exact strategy of casting instances and sorceries to give everyone infect and then proliferating for the win is Excel as a commander. There's a lot of green spells, or a green spell that does exactly that. So this might be a future deck. This is going to cost a lot. The only reason this is here is because I already have all of these textless cards, and this is just a theoretical deck list right here. So I'm unlikely to be able to build this anytime soon, but I really like these lands. I got a bunch of these lands last week, and I want to play with them, and I have these textless cards. So there's a good chance that I'm going to build this deck at some point in the future. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this little romp with Venser. If you enjoyed this video, then go ahead and click the thumbs up, give a like, comment, and all that stuff. If you want to support me in what's going on with me, actually, there is a link in the description below. You can read that if you like. I will link all of these deck lists down below as well. The 3 Venser decks specifically will be linked below. But yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this journey, and if you have any ideas or feedback, definitely let me know. Thanks.